So it is my very pleasant task to introduce Chris Jackson. So Chris is Professor of Sustainable Geoscience from the University of Manchester. And I think visiting professor at Imperial College London, amongst other impressive titles that he holds. In addition to his geoscience research, he is a keen educator and science communicator, and is very active in public and school engagement in the earth sciences. You may recognise him from such things as earth science focused TV shows, including Expedition Volcano and the wonderful Royal Institution Christmas lectures on the BBC. Chris is also actively involved in efforts to improve equality, diversity and inclusivity in earth science in higher education, and has published on barriers to participation in undergraduate fieldwork, dealing with racism and the diversity crisis in geoscience fieldwork, and ways to include LGBTQ+ staff and students in fieldwork. Chris will be talking to us on seen and unseen barriers to geoscience fieldwork. So hopefully Catherine will be sorting out the presentation.
I can share from my side, Catherine. Is that good?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, let's bring it up now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So over to you, Chris.
Can you see that?
Oh, yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant.
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. It's the first time I've ever given this talk, so I'm a bit nervous, and I have a sick kid next door as well, so hopefully she won't come piling through the door and join the talk. So yeah, it's a talk put together by myself and Sam Giles at the University of Birmingham. Some of you will know her as well. And it's based on our experience of running and participating in geoscience fieldwork. And on this introductory slide here, you can see three people who are going to pop up as kind of characters through the talk. Hendrata on the left there, who's a black woman. You know, that's kind of the visual impression you get straight away from her. Huna here as well, who is in the middle. You know, obviously he's climbed to the top of a big hill to look at some rocks. So let's think about that. But, you know, passing as a white man. And David on the right-hand side, who's a white male passing as well. And, you know, he's sitting in his car, but he looks like he's a big, strong fellow able to do fieldwork. So they're going to kind of be three people who are going to pop up at different points in the talk. And what I want to do in this talk is to sort of challenge maybe the perception you have of these people and the barriers that are seen and unseen for these people in terms of fieldwork from just their visual images on this first slide. So this is just to outline the positionality, if you will, of me. So what gives me license to give this talk? Why am I giving this talk? What am I not qualified to talk about, really? And so where might mistakes be made in my talk? So what about me? So I'm black, heterosexual, cisgendered, working class background, originally, now middle class, obviously, by virtue of my education, and first generation university attendee. I'm now middle class, I've got full-time employment, and I do field teaching at a prestigious quote-unquote university in the global north. I'm not disabled, I have asthma, but I'm not formally disabled. And I'm not a member of the LGBTQIA+ community either. And I absolutely love fieldwork. I love hills, I love rain, and I love dangerous situations. So, you know, that's where my view is coming from. And, you know, at the end of the talk, I'm going to stress why I think, you know, because of my personal love for fieldwork, we need to work much harder to make it inclusive. So when you search for geologist on the internet, this is what you often see. Almost invariably pictures of people in the field, and even, as you can see in the red box in here, pictures of people collecting lava from a fresh lava flow. So that's the kind of visual image often geologists have of ourselves, but also the general public would have about what we do. When we think about how important fieldwork is, there's a number of studies. There's not many, and there's lots of data. So there's quantitative and qualitative data being collected. So how important is it such that we have that vision of ourselves? Well, in this particular study, 90% of all respondents, and that includes learners, instructors, and industry professionals, thought that fieldwork was really integral to an undergraduate programme. you know, one of the statements made in here is that knowledge and skills gained through fieldwork cannot be learned in the classroom. So if we don't have fieldwork, we're going to have underskilled students being trained through our programs. But if you look at these results on the left, and I'm not going to talk through them, but only 37% in this particular study, and that number doesn't vary much across the 3 studies we've looked at, 37% said bedrock mapping should be the focus of a field course. And that's particularly what we have at the moment in geosciences, at least. They also say, most of the respondents, it is possible to become an expert geoscientist without fieldwork experience. It is true, it is not true that the best geologists are those who have seen the most rocks, despite the commonly used mantra. And bedrock mapping is not what geoscience mapping is all about. So when you look at these studies, a lot of people say it's important and it should be included, but actually what they're saying is it might not be currently what we offer, and the outcomes of that formal fieldwork training may not be the only way to making fully qualified and skilled geoscientists. There are some contradictions in here which I'll come back to. When we think again about like the importance, this is from an anonymized website. If anybody wants to know which university this was from, I can tell you, but there's comments like this: the skills lie at the core of an exploration geologist. The experience of seeing real-world exposures and outcrop. This is great here. Graduating geologists who have trained without the benefit of extensive geological fieldwork is like training doctors without ever allowing them to dissect a cadaver. Okay, so these are all comments made by 3 middle-aged white men on a particular university website. I'll just stress here at this point that this website was taken down 3 days ago after I made the university aware it was still on their homepage. The reading of books and the study of specimens will never make the geologist. The geologist is made in the field, not in the laboratory. And that is clearly a comment coming from 1955, but it is a mantra which is still held by many field geologists and otherwise, in this notion that a geologist is so hardwired to be ruggedly standing at the top of a hill. That's the only way we will be able to train people, and that's the only way in which one person could ever refer to themselves as a geologist. So that importance is captured if we look at the accreditation by the Geological Society of London for a range of geoscience programmes across the top, from geology through to geoscience programmes with maths and other combinations. We're looking at somewhere between 30 and 60 days of kind of mandated fieldwork, if you will, to get this quality approved stamp from the Geological Society of London. Within that framework, about 50 universities in the UK offer geoscience degrees. 31 of those are accredited at the time this talk was put together. All mention fieldwork on their websites, okay, between 40 and over 100 field days. At Imperial, we used to pride ourselves on having 100 field days over the course of a 4-year geoscience degree. 10 of those 31 charge some fee for fieldwork, which is compulsory. The cost for the independent mapping, and that's the mapping exercise that is typically done between the 2nd and 30th, the estimates on the website are between £400 and £1,500, and 9 of those universities mention some sort of financial assistance being available, but only 3 mention the fact that exemptions could be made for students. And this is explicitly on the website. This is not what that might be said in an open day or what might happen after you've enrolled and started. This is what's mentioned as the kind of gateway into entering into these degree courses. So when we think about risk, these are the things I think that are most readily in our head, aren't they? We've got things like, fall hazards here, working around cliffs. We've got as well things that can bite you, so the flora and fauna that can hurt us. We've got dehydration here in the bottom left corner. And we've got here this video, which isn't playing, but it's Wile E. Coyote scooting around on some skating shoes, some skates, and that's to communicate the fact that often travel is one of the big hazards when we're doing fieldwork. It's actually moving from place to place. Cars, minibuses, planes as well. So these are the kind of things we have as obvious risks maybe when we're looking at completing a risk assessment for geoscience fieldwork. Now let's look at some of the kind of visible and invisible, the seen and unseen disabilities. So using the HESA data from a few years ago, 17% of UK domiciled geology undergrads have a known disability. And when we think of disability, we often probably immediately think of physical disability. So like Frankie here on the left, who's wrote very eloquently about her experiences as a geoscientist who's disabled. We may look at somebody like Anita here, and again, I've included the links here for you to go and read, but she was involved in a car accident, but she's a ferocious field geoscientist still. It's a really inspiring read. Here you look at her, she's clearly in the field, as is Frankie. You might see she's got a walking pole as well, but, you know, maybe that doesn't mean much. But, you know, there are these stories inside what is an immediate physical view you have of somebody or image of somebody. And then, like, we go back to Hunar as well, Hunar on the first slide in here, and like I said, he's got to the top of this big hill, and so we're looking at this breadth of disability statuses here. But, you know, we look at Hunar on the left, and maybe it's not so obvious. And it's interesting when you read some of his blog posts. He's autistic and also dyslexic as well, and he talks about the impact of autism on his experience of geosciences and of geoscience fieldwork. And autism, therefore, is one of these potentially unseen disabilities that we are not thinking about when we're putting together risk assessments and when we're looking at a demographic we're teaching. But there is a chance that there are people who are autistic amongst the population we are teaching. Autism is interesting, having read a bit about it. And again, this is my positionality. I am not autistic, but having read around this and having talked to geoscientists who are autistic, you know, when we look at what a common work plan might be for a non-autistic geoscientist here, it's pretty straightforward. Wake up, breakfast, go in the field, come home, have some personal time and go to bed. This is a paper by Kingsbury recently coming out in 2020. But if we look at a plan for a geoscientist who's autistic, it's much more detailed. There's much more things about personal care in here: brushing teeth, showering, taking medication, exactly where you'll get, you know, how you're going to get to the field, exactly where you're going to be in the field, or where that geoscientist is going to be in the field, exactly what they need to do when they come back, medication again. So there's a much more detailed breakdown, which provides a much better framework for this particular manifestation of autism, because autism is not a singular experience. But it varies greatly, which actually is one of the things I think that coming new to this, which makes it very challenging, is then the requirement to have personal engagement with individuals within the corpus of people we're teaching to make sure that we're optimizing their experience, because they're all going to be experiencing the field in a very different way, rather than just thinking we have an autistic geoscientist amongst us, therefore we need to make sure that, you know, in a very stereotypical way, maybe, you know, we kind of simplify words, or we, you know, we don't overstimulate them. It's a completely incorrect view of autism, I've come to learn. If we focus on race and ethnicity now, about 10% of UK domiciled geology undergraduates are from a Black, Asian, mixed or other background, and 2% are Black. And what's important in this context are two things. One is then how that it presents a barrier, you know, why there might be a barrier to racial and ethnic minority engagement in geoscientists. And this quote here from this recent paper I wrote with Natasha Dowie led. So in an unpublished Geological Society survey of undergraduate students, 60% of respondents mentioned a lifelong interest in the natural environment. So if you don't have that access or ready interest in the natural environment, it's less likely that you will go on to study geosciences. And Anjana Katwa spoke very elegantly about this in this concept of black and brown faces in green spaces. You know, because if you don't have Durdle Door on your doorstep, you may not have that kind of initial love of the outdoors and the natural environment. But interestingly enough, in the urban environments where typically more racial and ethnic minorities are, rather than living in these suburban or rural environments, there is spectacular geology. This is just down the road from me in Stockport. This is the M60 road cut with a big sequence of Triassic fluvial sandstones exposed. So there is a way of bringing geosciences and geology into environments in which we have these racial and ethnic groups who are currently underrepresented amongst us. We just have to think about where that access can be provided and why, you know, these may be presenting barriers. Because I think if you don't think about it, that somebody's previous experience of just camping or being on a beach or scrambling up this rock side may actually be underpinning their love for geoscience to the point they'd want to study it, I think we're going to be missing out. The other bit of this, I said there were 2 points to race and ethnicity when we think about this, is also captured by Hendrata, who we saw on the first slide. And this is the problem of racial discrimination and racial violence in the field. And Hendrata's been subjected to this. And I worked with her and Josh Anadu, who you can see here on this call. And we've written a couple of pieces, or one major piece in AGEOS on this. But actually going into the field and being subjected to racism because you are primarily, as a geoscientist, remember, working in very rural white environments. That's an issue in the UK. It's even more of an issue if you think about areas rural the US, where Josh and Hendrata are based. So Hendrata also has this interesting other thing here where we think about intersectionality. That is where we have two, somebody who actually has more than one of these protected traits of protected characteristics. So she's a woman as well. So not only may she be subject to gender-based discrimination, she may also be subjected to race-based discrimination as well. So she's physically able, she's not disabled, Hendrata, but she still has two other compounding factors that may impact her ability to thrive and enjoy the field and actually develop her skills there. So moving on, and related to that, looking at gender-related barriers, these are probably some of the ones that most immediately are in our mind beyond scorpions, trip hazards, travelling and dehydration. But the idea that, in geosciences at least, women are still in the minority at 38%, with less than 1% being reported as non-binary. The gender-related barriers are varied, and there's three common manifestations shown in here: verbal, kind of sexual harassment on the left-hand side in here, physical sexual harassment, and non-verbal like sexual harassment as well. And all of these can present clear barriers that are occurring during our fieldwork. And one reason I think in geosciences this is particularly bad is because often geoscience fieldwork takes place in remote locations. It's often in rather large groups, and commonly, or at least up till now, a lot of it has involved quite a significant drinking culture as well in geosciences. It's one of the things that people historically have laughed about as being a really great reason to do geoscience and a way of attracting people to geosciences, but it's becoming increasingly clear that actually alcohol consumption during fieldwork is one of the things that can actually, and at conferences as well, I should add, are one of the things that can underpin all of these different acts of basically sexual harassment and presenting a gender-related barrier. You'll notice in this talk, what I'm not really doing is giving you solutions to anything in here. I think other presenters who are coming later on will talk about this. And I know Anya Lawrence certainly will be talking about ways of, practical ways of improving the situation. I'll present a paper that's worth reading later on, but I'm happy to come back to some of the ways to break down these barriers or remove these barriers later. Geographic perceptions of risks. We're coming back here to David, who was on the first slide. He's a geologist like I am. He's a structural geologist like I am. Geographers and geologists are probably all really great, and even ecologists and whoever else is on the call who works out in the natural world are great at reading maps, right? We look at this map and it's clear that there's risks around this map, okay? This is in Derbyshire near where I am. There's a reservoir, yeah? There's a river in here, there's a number of streams. These contours are all close together here. There's a cliff in here, okay? This is Mam Tor. There's a cliff up in here as well, in Grimesbrook Clough. So we're looking here, and we can look at a map, and we can see geographic perceptions of risks that may apply equally well to me as they do to David, right? But if we look at a map like this, okay, this is a very different map. This is looking at sexual orientation laws in the world. Are we able, or in fact, are we able to look at a map like this and actually then determine the level of risk? David is gay, and even though he's a fearsome field geologist and he doesn't have a disability, he is gay, and therefore the laws in certain countries and the way those laws are enacted present a risk to David in terms of where he can do field work, where he'd be safe doing field work, and where there's additional risk that may be brought to him that wouldn't be brought to me. Just to kind of unpack that story a bit more, I went through this last year with Imperial College. We had a field trip to Oman as part of the MSc course, and there was a big announcement on the 3rd of July last year that the Oman field trip was no longer going to be run. This change supports the college and department's commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion. I just want to tell you a little bit about the background of this story, because I think it's quite informative about how we might want to break down these barriers and some of the barriers that might be presented to us people challenging those things. So on the 29th of November in 2019, Imperial College was a Stonewall Diversity Champion. I sent an email which said, should we be taking the MSc course to Oman? given their laws regarding homosexuality. Sorry for asking but just now, but it'd been on my mind. And this has been talking to a few colleagues about this. And when I told them we went to Oman, they started to educate me about some of the issues. So I asked my course director at the time about this field course. The week after, I got this email back which said, we will continue to run the field trip to Oman. The benefits of the world-class geological education and the taste of the Middle Eastern culture far outweigh the potential negatives, so long as we are able to manage any risks to student and staff safety. We should not put people at risk without a risk assessment in place, especially when something is compulsory. Now, this was a message coming back from some people much more senior in the college after I expressed my concerns to them. We should not force students or staff into a situation where they have to declare their sexuality. And this is important because what was being said was that students should just say, okay, I am gay, or I am, non-binary, and I can't go on this field trip. But actually forcing people to declare that is actually deeply problematic. And sending students to countries like Oman should probably be reviewed. Okay, so this was all coming back from very senior people. Move forward to the early part of 2020, fieldwork was made optional. The field trip to Oman. They offered an alternative learning experience, quote unquote, to Derbyshire, which just coincidentally they asked me to run. So I raised the concern, and then they said, Chris, would you run this replacement trip, seeing as you may have these students who then have to out themselves, which is pretty horrid. And, preparation of appropriate risk assessment, they said they were going to do in pre-trip briefing. Okay, and they all went off to Oman anyway in February and looked at some rocks. Fast forward a few months to kind of Pride Month in June, and I brought this back up again. And the response I got is arrangements will be made to avoid risk, making the trip optional and developing alternative learning experience. So basically, a carbon copy of what had been said in January. So not very pleasing at all. Eventually, the trip got pulled. Within 4 days of that, I went pretty hard with a few other colleagues. I'll mention the acknowledgements, and eventually this announcement was made that the trip was not going to run anymore. I announced it got a lot of input, but I did get an email in my inbox that in the end this comes down to a political decision from a colleague who said this, who fundamentally could not see why this trip couldn't run for basically risk reasons. I got lots of criticism on social media and on LinkedIn from people saying this is sad, less field experience at geoscience is always a loss regardless of the reason. It seems like some students were missing out on some world-class outcrops for no reason. So again, people still can't see why. And I also got some criticism as well from some members of the LGBTQ plus community who would wish to go on that trip and were happy to assume that risk themselves. My response to those people is, I am not willing to assume that risk as a field trip leader on your behalf. Okay, so it's not just about minimizing risk for the individual, it's also around minimizing risk and that can be like physical risk, but also reporting risks for the field trip leader as well. So just to finish, there's a host of other barriers I've not really talked about in here, mainly that are, that are not really particularly well documented because we're not listening to people. There's financial barriers. Whenever we think of geoscientists, they may just need a hammer, a tape measure, and some, a little book about fossils. But actually, when you go in the field, it's a much more involved process than that. It's getting to the field, like I referred to earlier on, but there's also kit, waterproof kit, bags. There's a bunch of stuff which work against people coming from more from socioeconomic backgrounds which are less financially privileged. Religious and cultural considerations when you go in the field, whether it's around whether it's around times of religious observances that need to be made. So do we have an awareness of those things as field trip leaders? We've talked about the physical and mental demands, a bit of field work and caring responsibilities. People who may need to come in and out of the field because they've got caring responsibilities, and toilet stops, which was something which Sam worked on with Sarah Green and others, looking at this, it's called toilet stops, but actually they talked about menstruation as well, and talking about basically hygiene and considerations for women in the field. So there's a paper written on that which I do recommend. So geology rocks, right? Hopefully I've made it clear that fieldwork is really important, and at the start of the talk, and I absolutely love it. Often I get criticised quite heavily for trying to dismantle fieldwork from the geoscience curriculum and all this garbage. I absolutely love it. And what I want it to be is more inclusive and enjoyable as possible, not just for people who physically are struggling to get into the field, but also people who don't like being rained on. And so, can we make a field experience which actually means that they still appreciate the value of it, even if they are not field geoscientists professionally later in their careers? We have this urgent need to diversify and boost recruitment. We've seen this decline in geoscience numbers. Therefore, we're not in the buyer's position, right? We need to be actually selling our course in a better, our discipline in a better way, and we need to get rid of this gatekeeping where you need to be a field geologist to be considered a geologist. Geologists are made in the lab, they're made in the library, they're made on the mountains, they're made in all these different places. We've had lessons from COVID, there's alternative ways to meet learning objectives. Suddenly we found that virtual field geology allows us to meet some of the learning objectives. There's this idea that the objectives can only be met in the field, but this is by people who've not considered the alternatives. They have no pedagogic practice. They have no pedagogic background. I don't. That's why we bring with us these biases about what field geology is, and we need to recognise those. There's also changing needs of graduates and employers, and I said I'd come back to this. The current training is not effective. Remember I showed you the comment earlier on where a lot of people were saying that bedrock mapping may be not required from that Petovich study. And this is a survey from 2019 from the GeoSoc where 90%, 80 to 90% said geological fieldwork and geological mapping were important, compared to these other things like maths, materials, fossils, which didn't get much traction. But when it said, is it being taught effectively? Okay, so this was, is this thing that we think is really important being taught effectively? It's amazing, right? It's unbelievable. I mean, it's so low at like 17 to 20%. So we think it's really important, but we're not teaching it very effectively. So why is that? Surely that means that there's pedagogic practice we could bring to bear on field teaching, both physically in the field, but also using these virtual techniques, which we've heard about during the duration of the conference, to make it better for everybody. So yeah, this thing here, we have these barriers, we can go over them, we can go under them. That's very depressing. We don't want to do that. And in fact, we actually want to have people going through the barriers. And in fact, we don't want the barriers to be there at all. I chose this very carefully because there's lots of them with the bricks flying around. We don't want people to have to break through barriers. We want to remove the barriers because it's not up to these people here to be fighting to be included within geoscience education. And that's because diversity is nothing without inclusion. If we wish to diversify across all of these different protected characteristics we've referred to during the talk, once those people are studying this, we need to include them. Otherwise, they're just being harmed by the system they enter into. And I really encourage you to read this preprint that was released about 2 weeks ago, again by Sarah Green as lead author, but a range of people principally based at Birmingham, looking at safety and belonging in the field, again through the lens of geosciences, but it's widely applicable to other disciplines as well. So on that, I would like to just thank some friends and family and so forth who I've talked to, as I've learned a lot about this over the last 5 years or so, and who have helped me specifically with the Oman Field Trip Challenge and have educated me about some of my biases and about how we can make geoscience more inclusive. So thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. You're getting some love here with the virtual applause. Okay, so people have been putting some comments up in the chat, and I'm going to pick a few questions up there to ask you. We'll just start off with asking. So your experience with your university when you were having to address this issue about Oman. It was a reactive experience to something that was happening. You initiated it. How would you suggest perhaps that we are a little bit more proactive with our institutions to start these conversations?
I think what needs to be done is, I think if you have, in this case, we were a Stonewall signatory, so there was an overarching university commitment to a certain level of inclusion around, this specific group of people. So then you need to look at that and then see how that is expressed and manifested in a number of different things. And that would be, in our case, in this seminar, would be field work. So then to say, okay, just look at that map for a start and say, do we run fieldwork in these locations? If we do, what are the potential risks to the student and staff body who have to go there? So I think the proactiveness needs to come by looking at whether what you're doing is consistent with the stated values of the institutions in which we work. And that was the obvious thing for me to poke at straight away, as you saw on that slide. I was like, we're a Stonewall signatory. I've read Stonewall signatory guidance. I've read the college's webpage about our commitment to this group of people in terms of student and staff, and it's not being, that's in conflict with this field trip, was where I started from, personally.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question I'm going to pick out from the long list of comments and questions here is one from Julia Cook, saying, do you have any advice for ways to fairly share the work of making field work better? That is, how to avoid putting the onus on those facing the biggest barriers. It's sort of perhaps links to what I was asking before, but I'd like to hear your opinion. That'd be great.
We absolutely shouldn't be getting students to be informing us or getting students to do any of the lifting on that. And I would say that the students are the ones who have the least power and privilege in all of this. It's up to those who lead the field trips, obviously, and we individually have our own challenges and variable privilege. But I think as field trip educators and field trip leaders, we're the ones who have to do this, right? And it's people who are involved in risk assessment, compliance within any given department, who ultimately I think have to act as the gatekeeper, if you will, and say this risk is appropriate or not, would be where I would see it. So sitting with staff and not with students, I think that answers the questions. I mean, I think students can bring to us concerns, but I don't think we should be expecting them. Anya Lawrence, who's written these fantastic pieces, in some ways she shouldn't be having to write those in a way. I mean, it's great that she does and she spent her time and they're deeply informative, but in a way we've asked somebody who's, a PhD student in that case to inform a bunch of other people. Can I just pick a question up, Sarah, from the chat?
Yeah, please do.
There's a comment here by Adrian about Northwest Scotland arguably has some of the best exposures, I guess, but it's less commercially marketable. And that is true, but I think I picked that up with Brian Wegley's comment above where he talks about carbon footprint. So there is this marketability thing where, we have to do the biggest and best field trip to get people to come here. But I think we've got a bigger problem facing us before we need to worry about that at the moment. And I think it talks to what Brian's saying here is, I think if we reimagine how geoscience is being talked about, as an underpinning of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and sustainability and so forth, and lowering the carbon footprint of field trips is completely consistent with that and shows a broader environmental awareness by geoscientists. I think that could be used as a marketable tool beyond simply, we're going to go somewhere really hot and sunny. We need to stay rooted in those learning objectives as far as we can, as stipulated by the GeoSOC. I think there's a marketable issue, but I think we need to go hard against that. I think.
It's a really interesting point. We have I'm an environmental scientist. We have the same discussions as you're having in the earth sciences, across the board. There's an interesting comment there that someone's hoping that staycations over the past couple of years might increase awareness of the wonderful nature of our own country, whether it's in the UK or for other people on this meeting from other parts of the world. And from a UK basis, from geosciences, it's the most wonderful place. A lot of geosciences began with studies in the UK. We have such a diverse environment that perhaps we should think about how we take advantage of that.
You're making me laugh now, because you reminded me, there was so much criticism I got on LinkedIn from people saying the best limestones in the world are in Oman, and I went to Oman once and it was fine. Right, and that's the sum total of the argument, and that's all coming from white cis het men, right? Primarily in that LinkedIn case, who are all who weren't gay. And it was so bizarre, because it was just trying to get people to think about risks that didn't immediately impact them. which was just very hard for them. And I think most of them could get to dehydration, snakes, and trip hazards. But it was beyond that. It's these things which are unseen, effectively, you know.
Yeah. Someone made a really interesting comment about, you know, perhaps this should be part of our risk assessments. So it's Janine Madison was saying, do you think entwining risk assessment with an equality assessment for fieldwork could be a useful step in being more proactive? Perhaps building on the checklists with the blueprints that you highlighted. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a good way to go, is just to take a good long look at our risk assessments and see if they're fit for purpose, in line with what you know, the Green et al. Preprint is suggesting. I think there's a point here by Alison and Marcus, who she pinged in here, saying it needs to become part of normal practice for all fieldwork and one for accrediting bodies. And I really like this idea that the accrediting bodies could take away your accreditation if they don't believe your HSE guidance is inclusive enough. So, you know, and if the Geological Society of London, in this case, who are going through all sorts of challenges at the moment themselves, if they really want to think about who they represent and what they stand for and why they exist anymore, this has all been going on in this recent consultation. This is it, right? This is one of the things where they can bare their teeth and be quite direct about what they believe are minimum expectations around safety and inclusion for geosciences, because they are our large professional body, and they're going to be the ones who are going to facilitate change and increase diversity and inclusion in our discipline.
Yeah, and you know, the more we can discuss this amongst ourselves, be part of those bodies and part of the discussion, you know, involve more voices, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but again, it comes back to this idea that we need to be very careful here, where we're not trying to get EDI committees for the GEOLSOC or EDI committees for these bodies drawing from an already underrepresented set of groups, right? So a lot of, let's get a load of black people to serve on this committee, let's get a load of disabled people. We have to be really careful about burdening certain groups, going back to this original point, with the lifting on this. I mean, I get involved in everything because I'm a nosy Parker, but you know, we do have to be a bit careful about how we share that burden, I think, and asking women to do lots of things around gender, you know, equality. We have to be careful.
Yeah. Good point. Right, I think we could carry on this conversation all day, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop